Margaret Jameson staggered along the rutted trail, clutching 3 swaddled infants to her chest as if they were a single fragile bundle. Their faint cries were muffled against the threadbare shawl she'd wrapped around them. Each breath of hers came ragged, a cloud in the dusk, her bare feet cracked and bleeding in the cold mud. Behind her, in the shadowed distance, lay the house she had been cast from, the voices of her husband's kin still echoing in her ears. 3 girls, all at once? Cursed woman, you'll bleed us dry before winter ends. Out, and take your shame with you. She had begged, knees in the dirt, her arms trembling as she held out the babies, but their faces had been hard stone. Ezekiel's hand had struck her cheek when she did not rise quickly enough. The bruise still burned. So she had walked, stumbling through the night, her heart a tangle of despair and resolve. The babies shifted weakly, and one gave a mewling cry. Margaret tightened the shawl and bent her head low over them. "Hush now, my darlings," she whispered, though her own teeth were chattering too hard to form the words. She had no plan, only distance. Distance from cruelty, distance from the hatred that had declared her daughters worthless. The trail cut toward the river, where she prayed someone might take pity, though she doubted pity had much place left in this land. The stars had just begun to wink out of the east when her knees buckled, and she fell hard against the dirt. Pain flashed through her body, but she kept the babies pressed safe against her chest. She lay there, cheek to the frozen earth, whispering prayers that tangled into half-formed lullabies. Her eyelids grew heavy. She thought she saw light, faint and moving, across the black fields, perhaps only her mind's trick. Jonas Carter had been riding his fence lines with a lantern hung from the saddle horn, checking where the storm wind might have dropped a limb across his posts. He was a man given more to silence than to company, and the night suited him, the cold air steadying his thoughts. His horse snorted, hooves thudding in the frost-hardened ruts. Then the light of the lantern swung across a shape collapsed near the road. Jonas drew the horse to a stop. At first he thought it some deer fallen dead of hunger, but then the shape stirred, a cry lifting sharp and small into the night air. He dismounted quickly, boots crunching, the lantern light revealing pale skin, tangled hair, and the bundle clutched close against her. 3 tiny faces peeked from the folds, their lips bluish, their cries thin as reeds. Jonas crouched. The woman's eyes fluttered open, dull with fever, but when they met his they flashed with something like defiance, as though she meant to fight even now for what little she had. Her lips moved, cracked and bloodied. "Don't take them!" The words shivered into the night like brittle leaves. He shook his head once, slow. No words, only the certainty of motion. He stripped the heavy coat from his back and wrapped it around her and the infants. His hands were broad, rough with rope burns and callus, yet careful as he gathered her against him. She was light, frighteningly so, her weight no more than a half-empty sack of grain. He lifted her into the saddle and tied her steady with the coat before mounting behind. One arm secured her, the other held the reins. The lantern swung from the horn, throwing long streaks of gold across the frosted ground as he turned the horse toward his cabin. The babies cried, their voices faint but alive, pressed between her and the shelter of his chest. Margaret drifted in and out of awareness, catching only fragments, the warmth of a body behind her, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats, the smell of horse sweat and leather mingling with pine smoke on the air. Somewhere deep inside, her shame battled with relief. She did not know who he was, nor if he meant harm. But he had not pried the children from her arms. That alone was more than she had been given in days. They reached the cabin before moonrise. Jonas swung down and caught her again before she could slip. The door creaked open to a wave of warmth and smoke. He laid her on a bed near the hearth, then went quickly about stoking the fire, feeding it with split logs until the room glowed red. The babies stirred and wailed, their cries filling the quiet cabin with a fragile insistence on life. Margaret tried to rise, to soothe them, but her strength betrayed her. She half fell back into the blankets, tears streaking her cheeks. "Please, they're hungry." Jonas's brow furrowed. He moved to a shelf, found a pot, and filled it with water from a jug. Into it he poured dried milk he kept for emergencies, stirring with a carved spoon. He poured the mixture into a tin cup, let it cool, then knelt and tipped it carefully toward the smallest mouth. The child latched weakly, dribbling, but swallowed. He repeated the act with each. His rough hands held steady, as though he'd been born knowing how to cradle small, breakable things. Margaret watched through a blur of exhaustion. This silent man, stranger though he was, fed her children as if they were his own. Her lips moved, wanting to thank him, but the words tangled and dissolved. Sleep dragged at her like a river current. When next she woke, dawn light had broken faint and gray across the cabin walls. The fire was low, but the room held its warmth. The babies lay bundled together beside her, each with a softer color to their skin, their breathing even. She reached out a trembling hand to touch their foreheads. Warm. Alive. Relief cracked through her chest, but with it came a flood of memory. The faces of Ezekiel and his kin, the way they had pointed at her as though she were filth. The shame tightened around her ribs like a noose. She turned her head. The man sat at the table, mending a leather strap with needle and thread. His shoulders were broad beneath his shirt, his hair dark and uncombed. His face was all angles, marked by years of sun and wind, and unreadable as stone. He did not look up at her, but the fact of his presence steadied her in a way words never could have. Her voice was a rasp. "Why, help us." His hands did not pause in their work. His eyes flicked toward her once, then away. No answer. She pressed her lips together, feeling the heat of shame rise in her face. Perhaps he pitied her. Perhaps he thought her weak. Yet he had not cast her out, not stripped her of the only things that mattered. That silence, though it unnerved her, carried more mercy than all the promises she had ever been given. The day passed in fragments. He left briefly, returning with an armful of wood and another bundle she later realized was a rabbit, cleaned and ready for stew. He said nothing, only set the pot above the fire and let it simmer, the smell rich and wild. The babies slept, then stirred, and he helped her feed them again, holding one steady while she cradled another. His movements were spare, deliberate, as though words were unnecessary when the work itself could speak. When night fell again, Margaret sat weak but upright, watching the firelight shift across the log walls. The babies lay bundled between them. She dared to meet his eyes. "My name is Margaret Jameson," she said, voice soft as a confession. He studied her for a moment. Then, in a voice deep and rough from disuse, he spoke a single word, "Jonas." The sound startled her, not by volume but by the weight it carried. As if a stone had been dropped into still water, the name rippled through the silence. She wanted to ask more, but the effort of speech seemed too heavy. Her body still bore the bruises of exile, her mind the ache of betrayal. Yet in that one word she heard something she could not name, certainty, perhaps, or a promise unspoken. The fire hissed, a log collapsing into embers. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters, carrying with it the faint sound of distant hoofbeats. Margaret froze, her heart clenching. She turned toward the door, fear surging sharp and cold. Had they followed? Had Ezekiel sent someone to drag her back? Jonas had stilled too, his hand resting lightly on the rifle propped near the hearth. His eyes narrowed, not in panic but in readiness. The wind howled again, masking whatever sound might have been there, and then the night fell into silence. Margaret drew her babies close, whispering to soothe them, though it was her own heart she sought to calm. Jonas did not move from his place by the fire, but his gaze remained fixed on the door, as though he had already measured what he would do if danger came. The silence deepened, pressing on the cabin walls. Margaret swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the man who had lifted her from death's edge. She had been cast out with nothing but 3 fragile lives to her name. Now she lay in the cabin of a stranger whose silence spoke louder than the cruelty she had fled. The fear had not gone, but beneath it flickered the faintest ember of something she had not felt in months. A chance. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm Margaret had never known, a rhythm without shouting voices, without the whip of insult, without eyes that judged every move. The cabin creaked in the wind and smelled of smoke and pine, its walls hewn thick enough to keep the October cold at bay. She rose slowly from the weakness of fever, her body still stiff and bruised, yet steadier each morning. The babies grew louder, hungrier, and Jonas Carter moved about them with a silent steadiness that unsettled and soothed in equal measure. She learned his ways not through words but by watching. He rose before dawn, the sound of boots against the floorboards and the door's hinge whispering shut. When he returned, snow or frost clung to his shoulders, and his arms were burdened with wood or fresh kindling. He set it down without a word, eyes flicking once to where she lay with the infants, then back to his work. At first she mistook his silence for coldness, a kind of disdain. But she began to see how carefully he placed each piece of wood near the hearth, how he shook the snow from his coat so none would spatter on her children. There was a deliberateness in every gesture, as though he weighed his actions in place of speech. On the third morning, she found the babies bundled in a quilt she did not recognize, finer than the patched blankets she had carried. The stitching was careful, faded with years of use. She traced the seams with her fingers, and when Jonas noticed, he only gave a small nod before turning back to stir the coals. She wondered who had made it, what woman's hands had once sewn warmth into the fabric, but she dared not ask. She tried to help him, but her body betrayed her. When she struggled to lift the water bucket from beside the door, her knees nearly gave out. Jonas crossed the room in 3 strides, taking it from her without a word. She expected rebuke, perhaps the scorn she had always known. Instead, he simply carried the bucket to the fire and set it down. His silence was not dismissal. It was allowance, as though he understood she would keep trying until she could stand firm again. At night, when the babies cried, Jonas often woke before she did. She startled once to find him rocking one of the girls in arms broad enough to crush a man, his movements oddly gentle, his eyes fixed on the flames. He seemed almost carved into the firelight, his profile lit in gold and shadow. She listened to the creak of the chair, the tiny whimpering that quieted against his chest. In that moment, he looked less like a stranger and more like something older, elemental, a rock at the edge of a storm. Margaret found herself studying him when he was not looking. The weathered lines at his eyes, the scar along his jaw, the set of his shoulders. He rarely spoke, but in silence he revealed more than words might have. She noticed the way he turned slightly away when she caught his gaze, as though modesty had been etched into him, or perhaps caution. She feared her own thoughts. After years of cruelty, the sight of steadiness felt like temptation. Yet trust did not come easily. She had been discarded by those who once called her family, left to die with the proof of her failure in her arms. The memory was still raw. Whenever she closed her eyes, she saw Ezekiel's sneer, heard the slam of the door. She carried shame like a brand no fire could burn away. One evening, as the wind scoured the cabin walls, Margaret sat near the hearth, the triplets sleeping close. Jonas sat at the table, knife in hand, carving at a length of wood. The scrape of blade on grain was the only sound besides the sigh of logs. She leaned toward the warmth, breathing in the resin-sweet smoke, her voice low. "Why do you help us?" The knife paused. He did not lift his gaze, only turned the wood in his hand. A moment passed before his rough voice broke the hush. "Cold kills quick. Didn't figure you'd last the night out there." His words were plain, almost blunt, yet something in them carried more than practical truth. He had seen her on that road, half dead, and chosen otherwise. She studied his face, but his eyes remained on the wood. She wanted to ask more, to pry open the silence, but the babies stirred, whimpering. She bent to soothe them, and the moment passed like smoke. By the week's end, Margaret could stand without swaying. She set about small tasks, washing cloths in the basin, stitching her torn shawl, mending what she could. Jonas never interfered, but she noticed he worked around her, splitting wood outside when she bustled about the hearth, or fixing the door hinge while she sang softly to the infants. It was as though he marked her efforts as her own, neither praising nor hindering, simply allowing them to exist. That was new to her. Allowance had never been given freely before. Once, while she rocked one child to sleep, the others squirming nearby, Jonas returned with a strip of rawhide and sat cross-legged on the floor. With slow care, he cut and stitched until a small sling took shape. He tied it across his chest, tested it, then looked at her once, questioning. She hesitated before nodding. He lifted one of the girls into the sling. The baby whimpered, then nestled against his chest, soothed by the steady beat beneath his ribs. Margaret watched, something loosening in her chest. She whispered, more to herself than to him, "They're not a curse." His eyes met hers then, dark and steady. He did not speak, but she read the answer in the silence. He had never thought they were. The days shortened. Frost thickened on the panes. One morning, Margaret opened the door to see snow falling in slow, heavy flakes, settling on the world like ash. She clutched the shawl closer around her shoulders, heart thudding. Winter was coming fast. She had feared the cold since girlhood, the way it robbed the land of mercy. Yet when she turned back, the cabin glowed warm with firelight, Jonas bending over the pot where stew simmered, the babies bundled on the bed. For the first time, she felt winter might be faced rather than endured. Still, fear lingered. Some nights, she woke sweating, heart racing, convinced she heard hoofbeats beyond the trees. She would sit upright, clutching the babies, until the silence pressed back. Jonas always stirred then, eyes opening though he made no sound. His gaze went to the door, then to her, as if to say he had heard too. He never mocked her fear. He only kept the rifle close. The quiet between them grew heavier with meaning. She caught herself wanting his words, wondering what voice might hide behind his silence. She also feared them, for words made things permanent, and permanence had always betrayed her. So she let the silence grow, filling it with small gestures. Her mending his shirt when a seam split, her placing an extra bowl on the table though she had eaten little herself. Each time, he accepted without comment, but she noticed the way his shoulders eased, the way his hands lingered a little longer when passing her the bread. One night, when the storm outside rattled the roof and howled like a living thing, the babies cried in chorus. Margaret tried to calm them, but her arms were weak, her eyes raw with exhaustion. Without hesitation, Jonas stepped forward, gathering two into his arms while she held the third. He stood there, swaying, humming low and tuneless, but steady. The cries softened, then quieted, until the only sound was the wind. Margaret looked at him through her tears, her voice breaking. "I don't know why you care." He looked down at the tiny faces pressed against him, then at her. His voice came rough and used, like a stone dragged from a deep well. "Because someone should." The words struck deeper than any kindness she had ever known. She pressed her lips against the baby's head, hiding her tears. That night she lay awake long after the storm had passed, staring at the ceiling beams, her heart aching with a strange, fragile hope. The next morning brought clear skies, the snow a white blaze across the fields. Jonas saddled his horse to ride for supplies, leaving her with wood enough to last. Before he left, he paused at the doorway, his gaze flicking once to the bed where the babies slept. His hand hovered as though he might touch her shoulder, but he did not. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind. Margaret sat by the fire, the girls bundled close, staring at the door. In his absence, the cabin felt hollow, though the warmth still lingered. She realized with a pang how quickly she had come to measure safety by his presence. It frightened her, how much she needed it already. Late that afternoon, as she rocked the infants, she heard a sound, distant, faint. Hoofbeats. Slow, deliberate, crunching over the snow-crusted trail. Her blood turned to ice. She pressed the babies close and crept to the window. Between the pines, a rider passed, pausing on the ridge. She could not see his face, only the cut of his hat against the pale sky. He lingered a long moment, then turned his horse and disappeared beyond the rise. Her breath shook. She stumbled back to the hearth, clutching the children. The fire hissed, but could not chase the chill from her bones. She whispered to the sleeping girls, "They'll find us yet." When Jonas returned at dusk, snow dusting his shoulders, she did not speak of what she had seen. But he paused, eyes narrowing as he set down the sack of flour. He studied her face, then glanced toward the window, as though he knew already. His hand brushed the rifle leaning by the wall. Margaret pulled the babies tighter, her heart thudding. The fragile warmth they had built now trembled under the shadow of pursuit. The snow did not relent. By mid-October, the ridges around the cabin stood blanketed in white, the pines heavy with it, their branches bent low as if bowing beneath the sky. Margaret spent her mornings near the fire, her daughters wrapped close, the sound of their breaths steady as the crackle of kindling. Jonas moved through the storm with his usual quiet, tending the animals, cutting wood, clearing the roof. He seemed impervious to the cold, though his coat froze stiff at the hem and his hands reddened from the axe handle. He returned each time with snow glittering on his beard, his silence carrying a steadiness she leaned on even when she tried not to. The memory of the rider on the ridge clung to her. She told herself it might have been a trapper, a traveler lost, but deep inside she knew better. Ezekiel's shadow followed her even into this sanctuary. When she held the babies too tightly, Jonas would glance over with his unreadable eyes, as if he could hear her thoughts. He said nothing, but he began checking the rifle more often, oiling its parts, keeping it within reach. One night, as the girls slept bundled together in the quilt he'd given, Margaret found herself speaking into the hush. The wind rattled the shutters, and Jonas sat at the table, carving another length of wood. "I never told you why they cast me out," she whispered. His knife paused, but he did not raise his head. He waited, the silence urging her onward. "They wanted sons. My husband's kin. They said 3 girls meant God had cursed the line. Ezekiel, my husband's brother, called me a burden, said I'd eaten their bread too long, and all I had to show was 3 useless mouths." Her throat caught, and she pressed her hands over her face. "They said I'd best walk into the cold and let nature finish what God started." The knife slid once more, steady. She heard the scrape of blade against wood, but she felt his gaze now, heavy and sure. When she dared to look, his eyes met hers, not with pity, but with something harder. A kind of fury that lived beneath stone, banked but burning. He said nothing, but she realized he did not need to. His silence agreed with her pain more than words ever could. She leaned back against the wall, her voice breaking into the crackle of fire. "My husband, David, died last spring. A fever took him. He was kind, in his way. But Ezekiel, he always wanted the land for himself. When David passed, it was only a matter of time before they found a reason to drive me out." She touched the quilt covering her daughters. These 3 gave him all the reason he needed. Jonas set down the knife. He rose, crossed to the fire, and laid another log across the embers. The flames leapt, sparks flying, and in that light she saw the muscles shift in his jaw. For a moment she thought he might speak, but he only turned back, sat again, and resumed his carving. She realized that in his silence, he had accepted every word she spoke as truth, without doubt, without judgment. It was more mercy than she had been given by her kin in all the years she had known them. Through the following days, Margaret's memories spilled more freely. The words came when she nursed the girls, or when Jonas returned from the snow and set down the day's work. She spoke of the spring, when David's fever burned him until he lay cold in her arms. Of Ezekiel's hand on her arm as he declared the land his. Of the way the women in town turned their backs when she begged for work, whispering about her shame. Jonas never pressed her, but when she spoke, he listened with the same stillness he gave to the winter wind, to the fire, to the land itself. It steadied her, even when her voice shook. The babies grew stronger, their cries louder, their eyes brightening with each day. Jonas seemed to take quiet pride in it, though he never said so. He built a small cradle from pine, smoothing the edges, tying it together with rawhide strips. When Margaret laid the girls inside, their tiny fists waving, she caught him watching. His lips pressed tight, but his gaze softened, the hardness lifting for just a breath. One afternoon, while Jonas split wood in the yard, Margaret stepped to the door. The cold struck her face, sharp as a slap. She watched him drive the axe into the block, his shoulders heaving, steam rising from his breath. There was something anchoring in the sight of him, a solidity she had never known. She realized then how far she had come from the dirt road where she had fallen, her babies near freezing in her arms. This cabin was not yet home, but it was a place of breathing, of beginning. But the world beyond did not let go so easily. 2 weeks after she first saw the rider, a trapper stopped by the cabin. He traded pelts for flour and tobacco, his beard crusted with ice, his eyes sharp with the hunger of the trail. While Jonas spoke few words to him, Margaret felt the trapper's gaze linger on her, on the babies bundled at her side. He spat into the snow before mounting his horse again. "Saw another fella a skin after a woman with babes," he muttered, adjusting his saddle. "Said she run off, and he aimed to fetch her back. Big man, scar on his cheek. Mean look about him. Ain't far, neither. Margaret's breath hitched, her hands tightening on the quilt. The trapper flicked his reins, and the horse plodded off, leaving silence behind. She turned toward Jonas, her heart pounding. His face was carved stone, unreadable, but his hand went to the rifle leaning by the door. He brought it inside that night, set it within reach, and oiled its barrel by firelight. Fear returned to her like a tide, drowning the fragile warmth she had begun to feel. She whispered to the babies when Jonas stepped out to fetch water. "He's coming. He won't stop till he takes us." The infants stirred, whimpering, as if echoing her dread. That night, she woke to the sound of movement. Jonas stood by the door, lantern in hand, staring out through the frost-coated glass. She sat up, clutching the children. "Is it him?" Jonas shook his head once. He set the lantern back, but he did not return to sleep. Instead, he sat in the chair near the door, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the darkness. Margaret lay back, her heart still racing, but in the glow of the dying fire she watched his silhouette, broad and unyielding. She wondered if he had always lived this way, waiting for something to come out of the night. The following day, she tried to convince him. Her voice trembled, but her words were steady. "If Ezekiel comes, you shouldn't be caught in it. I'll go. Better me than your home burned, your land ruined." Jonas looked at her then, long and hard, as though measuring her worth in ways she could not see. At last he shook his head. "You stay." 2 words, rough, final. They silenced her more than a speech ever could. She wept that night, silently so as not to wake the girls. She had lived her life cast aside, and now this man she barely knew chose to stake his silence on her survival. It was a weight she both feared and longed for. The snow deepened, storms sweeping in from the mountains, making the world beyond the cabin seem distant, unreachable. Yet the danger drew closer with each whisper, each rumor carried on the wind. Jonas began to stack more wood, to store dried meat and grain, as though he sensed the siege approaching. Margaret helped where she could, though her hands shook. She tried to teach herself courage in his quiet shadow. One evening, as the fire burned low, she sat with her daughters in the cradle Jonas had made. She rocked them gently, humming an old hymn. Her voice cracked, but the sound filled the cabin with a frail warmth. Jonas sat nearby, sharpening a knife. The rhythm of stone against steel matched her song. When she finished, he looked up. His gaze lingered, not on her face, but on the children, their tiny chests rising and falling. At last he spoke, his voice low. "He won't have them." The certainty in his tone rooted deep in her chest. She wanted to believe it, to let it carry her as the storm closed in. But she knew Ezekiel's cruelty, knew the lengths he would go to claim what he thought his. The days crawled, tension coiled tighter with each hour. Margaret slept lightly, her ears straining for hoofbeats. Jonas grew more watchful, stepping outside often, his eyes sweeping the horizon. Their bond, fragile as it was, deepened in the silence they shared, in the unspoken pact forming between them. She found herself drawing strength from his steadiness, though fear still gnawed. On a night when the wind screamed through the trees and the fire hissed low, a sound cut through the storm. Hoofbeats, clear, deliberate, drawing near. Margaret froze, her breath sharp in her chest. Jonas was already on his feet, rifle in hand, his jaw set. He moved to the door, every muscle taut. Margaret gathered her daughters, heart hammering, and whispered their names like a prayer. The sound of the horses grew louder, closer, until it seemed the very walls shook with it. Jonas glanced back once, his eyes locking with hers. In that gaze was no question, only promise. Then the knock came, sharp and heavy against the cabin door. The knock reverberated through the timbers, sharp enough to rattle the lantern glass. Margaret clutched her daughters close, her breath breaking into ragged clouds. The babies stirred and whimpered, their small cries swallowed by the wind pressing against the cabin walls. Jonas stood motionless at the door, rifle steady in his hands, his broad frame shadowed in the firelight. The knock came again, louder, followed by a voice she knew too well. "Maggie!" The drawl slid through the storm like a knife. I know you're in there. Open up, girl, before we break the place down. Her chest seized. Ezekiel. The very sound of him dragged her back to the night she'd been cast out, the sting of his hand across her cheek, the sneer as he called her cursed. She pressed the quilt tighter around her children, heart galloping so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Jonas turned his head slightly, eyes finding hers across the room. There was no fear in them, only a dark calm. He shifted, lifted the latch with deliberate slowness, and pulled the door open. Snow burst inside, carried by the wind. On the threshold stood Ezekiel Jameson, taller than she remembered, his scarred cheek glistening with frost, eyes sharp with malice. Behind him loomed two hired men, rifles slung across their backs. Their horses waited in the swirl of white, stamping against the cold. Ezekiel's gaze slid past Jonas and landed on her. A smile curled his lips, cruel and triumphant. There she is. Thought you'd hide from me forever? You and them brats belong back where you came from. Jonas stepped forward, filling the doorway with his sighs. He did not raise the rifle, but the threat lived in the way he held it. The hired men shifted uneasily, their boots crunching in the drift. Move aside, stranger, Ezekiel said, his tone thick with command. Ain't your quarrel. Woman's mine by law, and them babes too. You've no right to keep her. Margaret shook her head, her voice a whisper torn by fear. No law binds me to you. Ezekiel's eyes narrowed, the smile hardening into a sneer. You'll find out soon enough. Town'll side with me. Always does. He leaned closer, the storm whipping his coat. Now hand him over before I make you regret it. Jonas's silence stretched, heavy as a held breath. Then he stepped into the snow, letting the door swing nearly shut behind him. His voice came rough, deep from his chest. They stay. The words struck like a hammer, breaking the air between them. Ezekiel barked a laugh, but there was unease in it. You think you can stand against me? Against the Jameson name? You're nothing but a mute fool scratching out a living in the woods. He gestured to his men. Take her. The hired men hesitated, glancing at Jonas. The snow thickened, swirling white sheets between them, the wind howling as if to warn. Then one lifted his rifle, aiming low. Jonas moved in an instant. The crack of gunfire tore the storm. Margaret screamed, clutching her children. Jonas had dropped to one knee, the bullet hissing past. His return shot thundered, echoing off the ridge. One man fell, sprawling in the snow, his rifle spinning from his hands. The other cursed, scrambling for cover. Ezekiel roared, lunging forward, his hand reaching for Jonas's throat. The two men collided in the drift, fists striking, boots churning powder into the wind. Jonas's rifle skidded away. Ezekiel's weight bore down, his hand closing around Jonas's collar. You'll die for meddling, he spat, his scarred face twisted with rage. Margaret's heart thundered. The babies wailed in her arms. She looked at the rifle by the hearth, too far to reach without leaving them exposed. Helplessness clawed at her chest. She whispered through tears, Please God, don't let him take us. Outside, the fight raged, raw and brutal. Jonas's silence had always been his shield, but now his strength spoke. He twisted, driving Ezekiel into the snow, their breath rising in clouds. A knife flashed in Ezekiel's hand, its blade catching the stormlight. He thrust downward, but Jonas caught his wrist, muscles straining, veins standing in stark relief. The struggle locked them together, the knife trembling inches above Jonas's chest. The storm screamed louder, wind tearing at their coats, snow blinding. Margaret could barely see them, only the dark shapes grappling in the fury. Then a sound split the night, Jonas's voice, louder than she had ever heard it. No more. With a surge, he forced Ezekiel's arm back, the knife slipping from his grasp into the snow. Jonas struck once, a heavy blow that sent Ezekiel sprawling. The man groaned, clutching his face, blood staining the snow beneath him. The last hired man fled, his figure vanishing into the storm. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the whimper of horses and the wail of the wind. Jonas rose, chest heaving, snow and blood streaking his coat. His eyes found Margaret through the storm, steady even as his breath came hard. Ezekiel staggered upright, hatred blazing. "This ain't over," he spat, his voice ragged. "Town'll side with me. They'll come for her, for them girls. You'll see." He stumbled toward his horse, clutching the reins with bloody hands. He mounted with a snarl, casting one last venomous glare at the cabin. Then he wheeled the horse and vanished into the storm, his shouts fading into the night. Jonas stood there a long moment, rifle reclaimed, his frame unmoving as the snow covered the tracks of the retreat. At last he turned, stepping back into the cabin. Margaret sat trembling by the fire, her daughters pressed close, their cries soft now, more from hunger than fear. Jonas set the rifle against the wall and crouched before her. For the first time since she had known him, his hand reached out, not to take, but to offer. His fingers brushed hers, calloused and warm, grounding her in the present. Her tears spilled freely, a sob breaking from her throat. She placed her hand in his, clutching as though it were the last solid thing in the world. "He won't stop," she whispered. "He'll bring others." Jonas's gaze held hers, steady and unyielding. His voice came low, rough but certain. "Then we'll be ready." The words carried more than promise. They carried a bond, forged not by oath but by fire and storm. Margaret felt it in her chest, an ember glowing where despair had lived. For the first time, she believed safety was possible, not in walls or laws, but in the hands of the man before her. The babies stirred, their small cries rising again. Jonas shifted, reaching to lift one from her arms. He cradled the child against his chest, the tiny fist curling into his shirt. Margaret watched, her heart aching with a mix of fear and fragile hope. The storm raged on, beating against the shutters, but inside the cabin, the fire burned bright. Jonas sat beside her, silent as ever, yet his presence filled the room more than words could. She leaned against him, exhaustion pulling at her, the girls safe between them. Outside, the snow buried the tracks of retreat, erasing the signs of battle, leaving only the endless white. But Margaret knew the threat lingered, waiting beyond the horizon. She also knew that whatever came, she would not face it alone. In the hush that followed, she closed her eyes, her hand still wrapped in his. The silence was no longer emptiness. It was promise. It was defiance. It was the sound of a man who had chosen to stand. And in that silence, Margaret felt something she had not known in months, perhaps in years. A beginning.